Thank you very much. Cześć, is that correct? Yay! I'm very, very happy to be here and share my experience from Testability. Okay, so for the past 3 years, I have been obsessed with Testability. It's been the obsession. I've been talking about this really, really important subject at so many conferences, and I've been working with it explicitly in my assignment because it's a subject that we actually can't talk enough about. It's so rich with different dimensions and elements that it's kind of difficult to grasp at first. It's almost like an iceberg. That's even too simple, but it's like an iceberg which might look significant on the surface, but once you start to explore it, you will understand the magnitude that lies beneath. So, as I said, I've been talking about this very, very, very many times, and I've talked about it so much that I've actually got bored or fed up with it. So when I was asked to keynote here at TestingCup, I thought I wanted to talk about something new. But as you can see, I reconsidered, and that is many thanks, or maybe not thanks, to my current assignment, which actually has the lowest testability I have ever experienced in my 17 years within software development. So the purpose today is to share and spread the awareness of testability and why it's so important. Testability. Testability, the ability to test. But what does that really mean? So last year I had this gig as a consultant to help a company improve their testing. And I remember my first day at this assignment. I was greeted by my new boss, and he was really in a hurry, and we managed to get me my badge, which I have kind of similar badge, but a lot smaller, in between his meetings. And we also, he also showed me where I was going to sit and where my new colleagues were. However, this didn't mean that I actually got introduced to any of my colleagues, and nor did I actually get a place to sit at on my first day. And it took me a week before I got a functioning laptop and an account, and actually several rounds with service desk, which was kind of good because I got to meet them and learn them. Sorry, I just dropped it. But the thing is that this actually gave me the time to observe and get to know more people during this time. And during this time, I got to meet Anna Lee, who was is a woman in her mid-50s, and she had this gray bob with black highlights and these really edgy black glasses. And she had worked in the business for about 30 years. In this company, she had been there for 30 years. She started off on the business side. And about 10 years ago, she actually got the opportunity to start in IT. So she was now working as a tester in the department which I was going to help. I asked if I could sit next to Anna-Lee and observe her when she was testing, because I wanted to learn more about the product. And without actually going into too many details, because as a consultant, you can't share everything, but some, like Johan said before. So I'll share a little bit of what happened. Annalie was sitting at her desk. She had a laptop in front of her, and she had an extra screen. And her desk was so organized. It's very much not like my desk looks like, but she had these Post-its that was very, very neatly organized, and she had information written on them that she needed for her testing. She had a small notebook that she also used for her testing. And on her screen was this web application. And the first thing she had to do to start her testing was to submit some kind of application form. And to do this, she actually needed some very specific test data. Test data which was some kind of user that already existed in the system. The thing was that this data had very specific configuration and parameters, and it wasn't anything that she could search for in the database. So when she was going through and trying to find the right data to use, she had to use a different tool and basically just check the parameters and see if at least she could figure out if they were kind of correct. After she had done this, she had to fill in a kind of application form with a lot of input fields, and some of them had very specific rules, and some had relationships to each another. This went pretty fast because she used fake data in some cases, but in some cases she had to have real data, or more like correct data, like correct zip code for this to actually work. Once she had done that, she hit the submit button. And that's when the waiting began. The page was loading and loading and loading. And I'm not kidding you if I think it took about 2 or 3 minutes before actually something happened. And Annalie almost apologized when she described to me that this was normal. The test environment had always been really, really slow, but had even gone worse after they changed to a VDI, a virtual desktop infrastructure. So now now it was even slower, the environment. And then, boom, application denied, or some kind of error happened. And I remember the face and how Annalie really sighed when this happened, because this happens apparently quite often. So she entered the URL again and started over the entire procedure. Waiting and waiting again. And the next time, request timed out. So Annalie described to me that it was really hard to know whether it was actually the test data she had chosen, or if it was the test environment, or maybe there actually was a bug in the product. This time, I remember that I think this is quite funny. Is Johan still here? Yes. About the log file. So I actually asked Annalie about the logging, if there was any log file that we could trace while she was doing her testing. And she said she thought there was one, but she actually didn't know how to use it or how to access it, so she didn't use it. The third time, application was okay. It went through, but it still left Annalie with the feeling that she couldn't really trust the results. During this period, I also spoke to a lot of developers. It's very good to be friends with developers. And I got to meet this guy, Kim, who was a very, very sad developer. The thing is, it turned out that I was really lucky. I mean, it took me 1 week to get my laptop, and I actually got admin rights on that laptop as well. He had been there for 4 weeks. He still didn't have a development environment. He had his laptop, but he didn't have any admin rights. And for once, I actually think a tester is more trusted, or we're more trusted than a developer. And when he actually got, his development environment, 7 weeks had passed. So this is just a snippet of the things that I observed during my first couple of weeks there. And I was keeping track of all the different kind of testability problems that I observed. And that mind map, which I had, it grew rapidly over the weeks, because they had some serious problems, which was good for me, because that was why I was there, right? So some of you might now be wondering, what does all this have to do with testability? Before we get into that, I'd like to talk about testing. So testing to me is an activity that, to bridge the gap between what we know and what we need to know about the product. But it's also an activity where we explore and we question the product in order to evaluate it. And we do this because we need to gather information about the product, how it might fail or how it might work, so that our stakeholders can make informed decisions. Decisions like, is the quality good enough? Can we release, as an example? And in that context, testability is the degree of how easy it is for us to test. Anything that makes the product faster or easier to test actually increases testability. On the other hand, anything that slows down our testing decreases testability. Why is this important? To me, there are 3 major consequences to why this is so important. And the first one is about cost. Low testability often, because I don't want to say always, but it often increases and affects cost. And in the current project where I'm working now, management is somehow compensating for low testability by bringing in more people. However, more testers won't help us if we don't have an environment to test on. So, unfortunately, that increases our cost. The second consequence, as I see it, is about the product. And I think many can relate to this one specifically, because low testability gives the bugs an opportunity to hide themselves for a longer time. It also gives them the opportunity to conceal themselves better, which might leave us with some really, really nasty bugs in that code. The third feeling, or the third consequence, I'm kind of giving away things here, is about our feelings. We don't talk about that very often. But the third consequence is how you feel. So how do you feel when the test environment is really, really slow? Or how do you feel when someone decides they need your test equipment more than you do? Or how do you feel when you're like in the zone, testing, coding, whatever you're doing, and you have to go to that meeting? Or how do you feel when all of these situations happens over and over again? You're pretty sad, or maybe even angry. So low testability can actually affect or cause mentally exhausting. I used to do a lot of workshops on testability, and I remember one very specific one. It was at a company, and it was a mix of people within software development. There were product owners, testers, and developers. And they had the goal to identify the things that actually made their daily work hard to perform. So the amount of Post-its that we actually created during this workshop covered, I would say, like a 2-meter whiteboard, basically. And the discussions we had, the 2 hours wasn't even enough to complete those discussions. So at the end of this workshop, there was one guy in the retrospective who said, I'm not really sure what the purpose, or if we did achieve the purpose you wanted with this this workshop, because it felt like a therapy session. It felt so good to get it all out, and it seems like someone is finally caring. Because this team, or this organization had been working in an environment where low testability had been there for a very, very long time. So their frustration was clearly visible. So one heuristic that I like to use is actually feelings to identify low testability. Feelings like anger or despair or frustrations might mean that you have a low degree of testability where you're working. But all heuristics are fallible. So does it mean if we have a software development department where everyone is happy that we actually have a high degree of testability? So that might be some food for thought. What I find the most interesting with testability is the holistic approach to it. Because testability is not one thing. It's comprised by different dimensions and elements, and all of these interact with each other, and they affect each other, and they affect testability as a whole. What's even more interesting is actually the dynamics of this, the dynamics of dimensions. So if you increase testability in one dimension, you might actually decrease it in another. And an example of this would be, let's say that you want to enhance a product and you want to make it more testable. So you change stuff in the product. And by doing so, you might introduce a lot of more new bugs. And a buggy product is a lot harder to test than a non-buggy product. So, context matters. Each software development and product is different. They might actually seem similar, but they all have its own context. So if we take a web application as an example, for the user, it might look the same. I mean, it's a web app. But for us here in software development, we know, or we should know at least, that it is and can be different. Because the web app might be a React app, or it might be an Angular app, or like in a case that I had, it was an old framework called Backbone, which the team had modified to fit its own purpose. And that's from the technical perspective. So from the business perspective, we might actually be dealing with an e-commerce solution, or we might be dealing with an internet bank or something similar. And how the user are using this product matters when we test. But Also, how we are organized matters. When we develop our software, if we work in big teams, or if we work in small teams, or if we have testers outside the team or inside the team, matters. Also, our skills matters, because all of us are different. So we have different skills, we have different personality, we have different culture. And what also affects this could be different locations, whether we are working in one location or whether we are working in several different locations, time zones, and so on. And then we have the interesting part. We have development paradigms. So is there anyone here that consider themselves working in an agile environment? Quite a few. For the rest, would you say it's more like waterfall or a mix, maybe, waterfall? And that's fine. This doesn't matter. It matters to the context, because all of this affects testability. And for those of you who might have experienced both, you know that it's different. So there are some specific context drivers or dimension and elements that I want to share with you, some that I find more interesting than others. And the first one is the tester. In this case, the tester is anyone who performs testing, and I find this is really, really important. Sorry. Because you might have followed the discussions in social media where some people actually claim that testers are no longer needed. The thing is, to me, testing is an activity, and testing requires a certain type of skill set. You need different type of skills. You need technical proficiency, you need domain knowledge, you need to know what techniques and approaches to use when you're testing. I mean, all of you that were in this competition yesterday knows, of course, you need skills to do good testing. And I remember I was sitting in this test team meeting, and we were having a discussion about a specific bug, some kind of bug. And this guy, this tester, he says, well, let me report it to the team who's responsible to fix this. Another tester then jumped into the discussion and said, like, don't bother. They never fix my bug, so just leave it. And the first guy, he kind of looked surprised and said, I don't get what you mean, because they always fix my bugs. I've never had that problem. I'll just go over and ask or talk to them. So when I analyzed the situation, it turned out that the first guy, let's call him Martin, his bug reports were difficult to understand, and the developer team actually didn't understand what they were about. And even if Martin tried to explain it verbally, they never got what impact the bug report had on the product. Martin was very, very technically skilled, and he actually used to attach log files and so on, and he used to describe the technical dimension of the bug. But what he often forgot, or maybe even didn't realize, was how it impacted the user or the business or the product. On the other hand, we have Anna Lee, who we met in the beginning, who had worked 30 years in the business. She was the one-to-go-to person when it came to everything about the business, how it worked, how the product worked, business rules, and who to talk to. But she didn't have the technical knowledge like Martin had in this case. So as an example, she didn't know how to use the logs or even how to understand what was happening in the system while she was testing. So these two are two different examples and just a few examples of what kind of knowledge you need to be a good tester or to perform testing well. So without the right skills and knowledge, the information that you're providing might not be that valuable. And that makes our stakeholders take decisions on very, very poor information. So the next one, state of mind. Just imagine that you're sitting at a conference. You are listening to a speaker talk, maybe about testability. And yesterday, you were at this awesome beach party. A few of you might have had a few drinks too much. A few of you might not have had enough to sleep or enough time to sleep. And it's almost lunchtime. I'm actually quite hungry. A few of you also might be hungry and are thinking about food, and some might actually be not thinking about food. So then the speaker asked you to test a dialysis machine, or maybe a submarine, like yesterday, and a bug in this software could actually have fatal consequences. So how would you feel if I asked you to test that right now? Confident? Some people, maybe. So the state of the mind can affect your testing, because when you test, you need to have an engaged mind. So, of course, feeling tired or having your focus somewhere else will also affect when you're testing and how easy it is for you to test. The next dimension or element I want to share is the team. So how many of you have been working in distributed teams? Quite many. And how did you feel about the information flow? Were there many times that you felt that you missed out on important information? Yes, yes. It doesn't necessarily have to do with distributed teams, but it can affect how easy it actually is to get the information. And once I worked in this project, which kind of claimed to be agile and working according to Scrum, but there was nothing in that project that was Scrum or agile. The testers, however, were in different teams. They were integrated in the developer teams. But one day, the manager, for some reason, decided to take out all the testers out of the development teams and put them together in a separate team so that they could be a team of their own. And he actually did that and put them physically in a different area as well. So the development teams, in this case, interpreted this a bit differently, and some of them actually stopped inviting the tester to the daily stand-ups. There was another team who invited the tester to the daily stand-ups, but they forgot to invite him to other important meetings. And on top of some of the developer teams were split into different locations, so the information flow was even harder to get there. All the testers had the same feedback. The biggest loss or the biggest impact was the information flow and the lack of information. Because before, they were part of this ad hoc discussions that normally happens when you're in a team, where you discuss requirements or design solutions, and all of this was happening when they were not there. One tester also shared that she felt really, really left out because there was no longer this team spirit going on. And before, they used to help each other when they had a deadline to reach, and specifically that was the testing that they used to help each other with. But now, now she was all left alone. However, this was not all bad. Because the testers were brought together, it meant that the information flow between them actually increased. And they could start to share knowledge, maybe about how the system worked and maybe how to read log files and so on. So that was a good thing. And this shows the dynamics of testability. It can increase in one area, but it could decrease in another. So when it comes to the product, controllability and observability are two different elements that are interesting. There are a lot more, like simplicity, that Peter Madsen talked about yesterday. But let's go back to Anna Lee and her problems of putting the product in a specific state. And Kim, who we remember, who didn't have a development environment. I talked a lot to Kim. And that was because he was a great developer with a lot of ideas. And over a lunch, I remember that I explained Anna Lee's situation to him, all the procedures that she had to go through. And I remember how he just looked at me and kind of smirked and said, I fixed that a long time ago. I got so bored of filling in all these fields that I just created a script that does it for me. This script was really great. It, however, didn't solve all of Anna Lee's problems. But being able to actually control the product, like we did here, for example, putting the product in a different state, is something that's helpful when you're testing and increases testability. During the lunch, I remember we chatted along, and I also brought up the logs and the problems we had there. And Kim actually shared with me that he too had a lot of problems with the logs. They were extremely poor, so when he tried to troubleshoot some problem, he couldn't really follow a transaction in the system, and the logs were really poor. In addition to that, the logs were distributed, so he had to check in very many different places to actually find the information he was looking for. So observability of what is happening in the system is very important for us, and it increases the testability and helps us to understand what's going on under the system. I think that a lot of us are familiar with the test environment, and that we can relate to the environment. Especially some of you might be able to relate to Anna Lee's slow test environment, maybe not as slow as that one, but things that can also affect are if we're sharing the environment or if we're sharing equipment, as an example. And in the current project where I'm in, we have tons of environments. We have so many environments that I have no idea of how many we actually have. Still, I can't find an environment to test on. And one of the reasons is because I have to book an environment months ahead, and I have to know what I'm supposed to test on that environment, which is very hard to say a couple of months before we're doing our testing. In addition to that, I have to kind of get my testing or our testing in between infrastructure changes or other teams deploying to the environment, which actually causes a downtime for us. So we have very little control kind of our test environment. It's difficult to affect the other things that interferes what we have the ability to test in our environment. this is an interesting topic, and it always, always comes up when you talk about testability, the measuring. So I was sitting in a meeting with upper management, always upper management, and I was trying to explain why it's so important with testability, and I was trying to explain the problems we had in our project. When one of the managers, he just interrupted me and said, yeah, I get it, you have to be aware and all fluffy and so on, but how can I measure it? And I kind of said, well, actually you can't. And that's not the answer he was looking for. So he went quite wild, and he was like, so how shall I know if we have improved then? And I said, well, you can look at one element at a time, and you can work with that one, and maybe you can actually say that you've improved in that. But testability is comprised by so many things, and there are so many elements that actually affect it, that it's difficult to measure with one single metric. And to be fair, it can be hard for people to accept that you can't actually measure testability as a whole. But it doesn't make it less important than that. So, one thing that I actually find more dangerous than low testability is perceived testability. So is this the shadow of a ninja, or is it the shadow of an orange? Things are not always as they seem to be. And that's the thing with perceived testability. I've shared some stories about how low testability affects us. But perceived testability is even worse. So if you take the example with Kim, where he had written this script to help us out, what if I miss some of the really important test parameters that I need? Or what if I set the product in a wrong state? Then you will think that you have increased your testability, but in fact it's just a perceived testability, which I think is more dangerous. You also have the tester who knows everything. So if you think you actually know everything you need about testing, you know how to test the product and so on, but that might not be the case. If then you will have big problems in finding those important bugs quicker. So in that case, ignorance might be bliss. And that happens quite a lot, or I have experienced that with many new testers, where they believe that they know everything, but they have not really understood the complexity or what they need to know to actually test the product correctly. So all of this are leading us to the future. And we are facing, I think, a very, very interesting future where, for example, development of AI and machine learning is happening as I speak. And Internet of Things is actually not a thing anymore, because it's part of many people's daily life. And I think many of us here expect a high pace of bug fixes and quick updates, and continuous delivery is actually widely spread. And the role of the tester is changing. Many people think that testers are no longer needed, but I believe that skilled testing is now needed more than ever. How easy it is to test will become more important and needs more focus as technology advances and becomes more complex. so that we actually can find those nasty bugs as quick as possible. And whether we are agile, or whether we are in a waterfall project, or whether we have testers or no testers, we all need to advocate for testability so that we can find those bugs as quick as possible. Because a high degree of testability helps everyone in a software development project, not only testers. And as I stated in the beginning, we are not done yet. So I have only one thing to ask you, and that is when you get back to your work, or maybe even now, try to think about 3 things, 3 testability problems. Choose one to improve, because we can all help to increase testability. Thank you.